Marcus Thompson wiped the grease from his weathered hands with a torn cloth that had seen better days. The old mechanic's garage sat on the edge of Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. At 62, Marcus had been fixing engines for over 4 decades, but the past 5 years had been different. Ever since he returned from his final deployment overseas, he preferred the company of machines to people. The garage door stood half open, letting in the cool evening air of late September. Marcus worked alone now, having let go of his last employee when business slowed down. The modern auto shops in the city had taken most of his customers, leaving him with the occasional tractor repair and the loyalty of a few old-timers who trusted his skilled hands more than computer diagnostics. His routine never changed. Wake at dawn, black coffee, and toast, then straight to the garage. Work until the sun set, eat a simple dinner, watch the news, and sleep. The nightmares from his military days had finally stopped coming, replaced by a peaceful emptiness that Marcus had learned to appreciate. No complications, no surprises, no one depending on him for anything more than fixing their broken machines. That Tuesday evening seemed no different from any other. Marcus was rebuilding the carburetor of a 1987 Chevy pickup when he heard the sound. It started as a low humming, almost like a diesel engine idling in the distance. But there was something else mixed in, something that made the fine hairs on his neck stand up. The sound grew louder, and Marcus realized it was coming from above. He stepped outside and looked up at the darkening sky. What he saw made him question his sanity. 3 shapes moved across the evening stars, but they were unlike any aircraft he had ever seen. They glided without the roar of jet engines, their forms seeming to shift and flow like liquid metal. As they drew closer, Marcus could make out details that defied explanation. They were dragons, not the mythical creatures from children's books, but something far more alien and magnificent. Their bodies seemed to be made of a substance that shifted between metal and flesh, gleaming with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Their wings were translucent, catching and bending the light in impossible ways. Each dragon was roughly the size of a small airplane, but they moved with the grace of birds. Marcus stood frozen in his driveway, carburetor parts still clutched in his oil-stained hands. The dragons circled his property 3 times before landing in the empty lot behind his garage. The ground trembled slightly as they touched down, their crystalline claws digging into the earth. For several minutes, neither the man nor the creatures moved. Marcus felt his military training kick in, his mind automatically assessing threats and escape routes. But these beings showed no signs of aggression. Instead, they seemed to be studying him with the same intensity that he was studying them. The largest of the 3 dragons, its hide shifting between deep blue and silver, took a step forward. Marcus noticed that despite their size, they moved with surprising quietness. The dragon's head was elongated and elegant, with eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. When it opened its mouth, Marcus expected fire or some alien roar. Instead, words formed in his mind. The communication wasn't heard but felt like thoughts that weren't his own suddenly, appearing in his consciousness. The dragon's mental voice was calm and measured, carrying undertones of both ancient wisdom and urgent need. Human mechanic, the thoughts came, "We have traveled far to find one with your skills. Our kind faces a crisis that threatens not only us, but your world as well. We require assistance from one who understands the harmony between living beings and mechanical systems." Marcus blinked hard, wondering if the stress of years of solitude had finally caught up with him. But the dragons remained, solid and real in the fading daylight. He found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you talking about? I fix cars and tractors. I don't know anything about dragons or alien technology." The second dragon, smaller and with hide that shimmered between green and gold, stepped forward. Its mental voice was gentler, almost musical in his thoughts. You have spent your life understanding how different parts work together to create something greater than the sum of their components. This skill transcends the boundary between your mechanical devices and our biomechanical nature. We are not fully organic, nor are we purely artificial. We are something between, and that intersection is where your expertise is needed. Marcus set down the carburetor parts on his workbench, his hands shaking slightly. He had seen many strange things during his military service in various parts of the world, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible, but the evidence stood before him, breathing and glowing in the twilight. The third dragon, the smallest of the group, had remained silent until now. Its coloring was more muted, shifting between copper and brown tones. When it finally communicated, its mental voice carried a note of pain that made Marcus wince. "Time grows short," it said simply. "The corruption spreads. Soon we will be unable to function, and the barrier we maintain will fail." "What barrier?" Marcus asked, surprised by his own willingness to engage in this impossible conversation. The large blue dragon stepped closer, and Marcus could see intricate patterns etched into its hide, like circuit boards made of living light. "Your world exists alongside others, separated by barriers that prevent chaos from spilling between realities. Our kind has maintained one such barrier for millennia, but we are failing. The biomechanical systems that allow us to channel the necessary energy are breaking down, and we lack the knowledge to repair them." Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair. "I still don't understand what you think I can do. I've never seen anything like you before." The green dragon moved to his left side, and Marcus noticed that its breathing seemed labored, as if it was struggling with some internal malfunction. "Your military records show extensive experience with hybrid systems, biological and mechanical integration for prosthetics and medical devices. You have also spent decades understanding how to diagnose problems in complex systems by observing symptoms rather than relying solely on diagnostic equipment. These skills, combined with your intuitive understanding of how living and mechanical systems can work in harmony, make you uniquely qualified to help us." The revelation that these beings knew about his military service sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He had worked on classified projects during his service, developing interfaces between human nervous systems and mechanical prosthetics for injured soldiers. That knowledge was supposed to be buried in government files that no one should have access to. "How do you know about my military work?" he asked, his voice taking on a harder edge. The blue dragon's mental voice carried what might have been the equivalent of a sad smile. "We have been watching your world for a long time, learning about those who might be able to help us when the time came. Your work saved many of your fellow soldiers, allowing them to regain function they thought was lost forever. We need that same innovative thinking applied to our crisis." Marcus looked at each of the three dragons in turn. Despite their alien appearance, there was something in their manner that reminded him of the wounded soldiers he had worked with years ago. They carried themselves with dignity, but he could sense an underlying desperation that they were trying to hide. The sun had completely set now, and the dragon's internal lighting provided an eerie illumination to the scene. Marcus realized that his neighbors might notice the strange glow coming from behind his garage, but somehow he suspected that these beings had ways of avoiding unwanted attention. "If I were to help you," he said slowly, "what exactly would that involve?" The copper dragon lifted its head, and for the first time, Marcus saw something like hope in its glowing eyes. "You would need to come with us to our realm to see the source of our problem firsthand. We cannot bring our damaged kin to your world, as they are too large and too unstable. The journey would not be without risk, but we believe you are the only one who can save both our species and your world from the chaos that will follow if we fail." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the impossible choice before him. His life in Millbrook was simple and predictable. He had no family, few friends, and no obligations beyond his daily routine. But the idea of leaving everything he knew to venture into an alien realm with 3 dragons was terrifying. Yet something deep inside him, something that had been dormant since he returned from his last deployment, began to stir. It was the part of him that had thrived on solving impossible problems, on finding ways to help when everyone else had given up. The part of him that had earned commendations for innovations that no one thought were possible. How long would this take, he asked. Time moves differently in our realm, the blue dragon replied. What might seem like weeks to you, there could be only days here. But we cannot guarantee your safe return. The corruption affecting our biomechanical systems is aggressive and unpredictable. Marcus looked back at his garage, at the half-finished carburetor, and the simple life he had built for himself. Then, he looked at the 3 magnificent beings who had sought him out across impossible distances because they believed he could help save 2 worlds. The green dragon sensed his internal struggle. We understand that we ask much of you. If you choose to refuse, we will respect your decision and seek help elsewhere, though we believe the chances of success will be much smaller. And if I agree to help but can't solve your problem, then at least we will have tried everything possible, the copper dragon replied. Sometimes the attempt itself has value, even when success is not guaranteed. Marcus nodded slowly. It was the same philosophy he had lived by during his military service and throughout his career as a mechanic. You try everything possible, and you don't give up until you've exhausted every option. I'll need to know more about what's wrong with your systems before I can decide if I can help, he said finally. The 3 dragons exchanged what Marcus interpreted as relieved glances. The blue dragon stepped forward again. That is all we can ask. Are you willing to let us show you what we face? Marcus took a deep breath, tasting the cool evening air and wondering if it might be one of the last normal moments of his life. Show me, he said. The dragons arranged themselves in a triangle around Marcus. Their inner lights began to pulse in synchronization, and the air between them started to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Marcus felt a strange, tingling sensation, as if every nerve in his body was suddenly more alive than it had been in years. The world around him began to blur and shift, and for a moment, Marcus wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But as the familiar surroundings of his garage and the town beyond began to fade away, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of stepping into the unknown to face a challenge that might be impossible to solve. The last thing he saw of his old life was the glow of the street lamps coming on in Millbrook, their light growing dimmer and more distant until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the pulsing radiance of the 3 alien dragons and the promise of an adventure that would test everything he thought he knew about the intersection of life and machinery. Marcus felt his stomach lurch as reality twisted around him. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced, even during the helicopter crashes he had survived during his military service. It was as if every molecule in his body was being gently pulled apart and reassembled somewhere else entirely. When the disorientation finally passed, Marcus found himself standing on what appeared to be a vast platform made of the same shifting material as the dragon's hides. The surface beneath his feet was solid, but seemed to pulse with internal light, creating patterns that reminded him of neural networks or circuit boards. Above him stretched a sky unlike anything on Earth, filled with swirling colors that had no names and lit by twin suns that cast everything in an otherworldly glow. "Welcome to the Nexus," the blue dragon said, its mental voice now accompanied by a subtle harmony, as if other voices were joining in from a great distance. "This is where our kind gathers to maintain the barriers between worlds." Marcus looked around in wonder and growing concern. The platform they stood on was enormous, easily the size of several football fields, but it was only one of dozens that floated in the colorful sky at various levels. Each platform held different structures, some recognizable as buildings while others defied description entirely. Connecting the platforms were bridges that seemed to be made of crystallized light, and along these bridges, Marcus could see other dragons moving with obvious urgency. But something was clearly wrong. Many of the dragons moved with the same labored gait he had noticed in the green dragon, and several of the platforms flickered with unstable light. Worst of all, Marcus could see that some of the bridges had dark sections where the light had failed entirely, forcing the dragons to find longer routes between platforms. The corruption started small, the copper dragon explained, noticing his observations. A few individuals experiencing minor system failures. We thought it was simply age, as some of our kind are very old by your standards. But then it began spreading, affecting younger dragons, and even the infrastructure itself. Marcus walked to the edge of the platform and looked down. Far below, he could see what appeared to be machinery of impossible scale and complexity. Massive crystalline structures pulsed with energy that flowed through tubes and conduits that stretched beyond the horizon. But even from this height, Marcus could see dark patches where the flow had stopped or become erratic. That's the heart of the barrier system, the green dragon said, moving to stand beside him despite the obvious effort it cost. It's biomechanical, grown rather than built. Each dragon contributes to its function through neural interfaces that connect us to the system. But as more of us become corrupted, the system becomes increasingly unstable. Marcus studied the vast mechanism below with the eye of someone who had spent his life making broken things work again. Even without understanding the technology involved, he could see the patterns that indicated system failure. Dead sections that should be active, erratic pulses where the flow should be steady, and what appear to be feedback loops that were amplifying problems instead of correcting them. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "In your time measurement, approximately 18 months, the blue dragon replied. "But the rate of failure has accelerated dramatically in recent weeks. We estimate that we have perhaps 30 of your days before the system fails entirely. And if it fails?" The three dragons exchanged glances that Marcus was beginning to recognize as their equivalent of grave concern. "Your world will experience what you might call dimensional bleeding," the copper dragon explained. "Energies and entities from other realities will begin to seep through. At first, the effects will be subtle. Electronic systems will begin to malfunction in ways that defy explanation. Weather patterns will become increasingly chaotic. But eventually, the boundaries will collapse entirely." Marcus felt a chill despite the warm, alien air. What would that look like? Imagine your worst natural disasters occurring simultaneously and continuously, the green dragon said quietly. But that would only be the beginning. The entities from the chaos realms would eventually find their way through, and they have no concept of the delicate balance that life requires. The magnitude of the situation began to sink in for Marcus. These beings weren't just asking for his help with their problem. They were asking him to help save Earth itself. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. "Show me one of the affected dragons," he said finally. "I need to understand what's actually happening to your biomechanical systems." The blue dragon nodded. "We hope you would ask. Follow us." They moved across the platform toward a structure that looked like a cross between a hospital and a high-tech laboratory. As they walked, Marcus noticed other dragons watching him with what he interpreted as curiosity and hope. Word of his arrival had apparently spread quickly through their community. Inside the structure, the lighting was softer and more focused. Marcus saw dozens of dragons in various states of distress, attended by others who were obviously trying to help. Some lay completely still, their internal lights dim and flickering. Others moved restlessly, as if fighting against some internal malfunction. "This is Keeper Thylos," the green dragon said, approaching a large dragon whose hide had lost most of its natural shimmer. She was one of our primary interface specialists before the corruption affected her neural pathways. Marcus approached carefully, noting that the affected dragon's breathing was irregular and that the patterns of light under her skin flickered randomly instead of pulsing in the steady rhythm he had observed in the healthy dragons. "May I examine her?" he asked. The blue dragon communicated with the affected dragon in rapid mental exchanges that Marcus couldn't follow. After a moment, Keeper Thylos raised her head and looked directly at Marcus. When she spoke, her mental voice was fragmented and filled with static. The connection's wrong. Feel that cascading cannot stop the help me. Marcus could see that she was experiencing something like the electronic equivalent of pain. Her neural interfaces, whatever they were malfunctioning in ways that caused continuous discomfort. Where exactly are these neural interfaces located? Marcus asked. The copper dragon gestured toward the base of Thylas' skull, where Marcus could now see a series of crystalline growths that pulsed with erratic light. They grow naturally as we mature, allowing us to connect with both the barrier system and each other. In healthy dragons, they maintain perfect synchronization with our biological rhythms. Marcus knelt beside the suffering dragon and studied the crystal formations closely. His trained eye immediately picked up on several anomalies. The crystals themselves appeared to be healthy, but the connections between them showed signs of what looked like interference or feedback. It's like a ground loop in an electrical system, he muttered, more to himself than to the others. The signals are bouncing back and forth instead of flowing cleanly. He looked up at the three dragons who had brought him here. I need to understand more about how these interfaces normally function. Do you have any dragons who are still completely unaffected? A few of the youngest ones, the green dragon replied. But we hesitate to expose them to the risk of examination. Understand, Marcus said, but I need a baseline for comparison. And I need to understand what changed in the environment here about 18 months ago. Something triggered this cascade failure. And unless we identify and address the root cause, any treatment I might develop will only be temporary. The blue dragon's mental voice carried new respect. You think like a systems engineer. Most healers focus on symptoms rather than causes. I'm not a healer, Marcus replied. I'm a mechanic. When something breaks, you don't just fix the most obvious problem. You figure out why it broke in the first place, or it'll just break again. Over the following hours, Marcus was introduced to several more affected dragons and given access to their equivalent of technical manuals. The dragon's knowledge was stored in shared memory networks rather than written documents, so Marcus had to allow them to directly transfer information into his mind. The process was disorienting, but incredibly efficient. What he learned was both fascinating and troubling. The dragon's biomechanical systems were far more sophisticated than anything humans had developed, seamlessly integrating organic neural networks with crystalline computing structures. Each dragon was essentially a living supercomputer capable of processing and channeling enormous amounts of dimensional energy. But Marcus also discovered that the dragon's technology had one critical weakness. Their systems had evolved over millions of years in a stable environment, and they lacked the adaptive mechanisms that human technology had developed to deal with unexpected interference. You've been dealing with clean signals for so long that your systems never learned how to filter out noise, Marcus explained to a gathering of dragon engineers and healers. Something has introduced a new type of interference into your environment, and your neural interfaces are trying to process it as if it were valid data. But what could cause such interference? Asked the blue dragon, whom Marcus had learned was called Keeper Zorith. We monitor our realm constantly for any changes that might affect the barrier system. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about the patterns he had observed in the affected dragons. The interference isn't coming from your realm, he said finally. It's coming through the barriers themselves, from one of the realities you're trying to keep separate. The implications of this hit the dragon community like a shockwave. If Marcus was correct, then the corruption wasn't a natural failure of their systems, but an attack from something on the other side of the barriers they maintained. But the barriers have never been permeable to anything but the most basic energy transfers, protested an elderly dragon whose hide showed the deep copper of advanced age. What could possibly generate interference strong enough to affect us through dimensional barriers? Marcus wished he had a comforting answer, but his analysis pointed to a disturbing conclusion. Something that's learned to mimic your communication protocols, he said. The corruption isn't random noise. It's a signal that's designed to look like legitimate dragon neural traffic, but with subtle modifications that cause system failures. The gathering of dragons erupted in rapid mental exchanges that Marcus couldn't follow, but their agitation was obvious. Finally, Keeper Zorth restored order. If you are correct, then we face an intelligence that understands our technology well enough to turn it against us. But how is that possible? No other species in the known realities has developed biomechanical integration to our level. Maybe it's not another species, Marcus said quietly. Maybe it's something that learned by observing your communications over time. The possibility that hung in the air was one that none of them wanted to voice directly. If something had been monitoring dragon communications for years or decades, learning their protocols and systems, then the current crisis wasn't an accident or a natural failure. It was a carefully planned attack designed to bring down the barriers between realities. Marcus looked around at the assembled dragons, seeing fear in their glowing eyes for the first time since his arrival. But he also saw determination and hope. They had brought him here because they believed he could solve their problem. And, despite the growing complexity of the situation, Marcus felt his old confidence returning. We need to do two things, he said firmly. First, we need to develop a way to filter out the false signals so your affected dragons can recover. Second, we need to trace these signals back to their source and figure out what's sending them. Keeper Zorth stepped forward. Are you certain this is possible? The barrier system was designed to be impermeable to prevent exactly this type of interference. Marcus smiled grimly. Every security system has vulnerabilities. Whoever is doing this found yours and figured out how to exploit it. But that also means there's a way to block it once we understand how it works. And if we cannot develop such a solution in time, Marcus looked out through the transparent walls of the medical facility at the vast machine that maintained the barriers between worlds. Then, we'll have to consider more drastic options. But let's focus on fixing the problem first before we start planning for worst-case scenarios. As the dragons dispersed to begin implementing his suggestions, Marcus remained behind with Keeper Thylos. The affected dragon had been listening to the entire conversation, and, despite her obvious discomfort, Marcus could sense that her mind was still sharp. You understand what's happening better than the others, don't you? He asked gently. Thylos raised her head with effort, her mental voice still fragmented but determined. The patterns I recognize from long ago, before the barriers, something that was locked away. Marcus felt a chill as the implications of her words sank in. You think the barrier system isn't just keeping something out of our reality. You think it's keeping something locked in one of the other realities? Prison, not just protection. Thylos managed before exhaustion forced her to rest again. Marcus stood up slowly, his mind racing with new possibilities. If the dragon barrier system was actually a dimensional prison as well as a protective barrier, then the corruption affecting the dragons might not be an attack from outside. It might be an escape attempt from within. Marcus spent the next 3 days working with barely any rest, driven by the growing urgency of the situation and his own fascination with the challenge. The dragon engineers had provided him with access to their most sophisticated analysis tools, devices that interface directly with his nervous system to let him perceive energy patterns the human senses could never detect. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. The corruption wasn't just mimicking dragon neural protocols, it was learning and adapting in real time. Each attempt the dragons made to filter out the false signals resulted in a corresponding evolution in the attack patterns. Whatever intelligence was behind this had access to their communications and was actively working to counter their defensive measures. It's like fighting a virus that can read your immune system's playbook, Marcus explained to a gathering of the Dragon Council. Every time we develop a new countermeasure, the corruption adapts to overcome it. Elder Korvash, the ancient copper dragon who led the council, shifted uncomfortably on his platform. Then, You believe Keeper Thylas's theory is correct? That something imprisoned in the dimensional matrix has found a way to communicate through the barrier system. Marcus nodded grimly. Not just communicate. It's been studying you for years, maybe decades, learning how your systems work. Now it's trying to break down the barriers from the inside by convincing your biomechanical systems to shut themselves down. But what could possibly have such intelligence and motivation? Asked Keeper Zorith. Our records show that the entity the barrier system contains was imprisoned eons ago, long before any known civilization developed advanced technology. Maybe it didn't start out with advanced technology, Marcus suggested. Maybe it learned by watching you maintain the prison that holds it. The implications were staggering. If Marcus was correct, then the dragons had unknowingly created the perfect teacher for their eventual destroyer. Every maintenance cycle, every system upgrade, every technological advancement had been observed and analyzed by something with infinite patience and growing intelligence. We need to know exactly what you're keeping locked up, Marcus said firmly. I can't develop an effective countermeasure without understanding what we're fighting against. The council exchanged glances that Marcus had learned to interpret as deep reluctance. Finally, Elder Corvash spoke. The records of the original imprisonment are incomplete. What we know comes from fragments passed down through generations of keepers. The entity was described as a force of pure chaos, something that existed before the ordered structures of reality itself. It was not destroyed because it could not be destroyed, only contained. But it must have some kind of intelligence, Marcus pressed. Random chaos couldn't develop the sophisticated attack patterns we're seeing. Intelligence, yes, admitted Keeper Zorith, but not intelligence as we understand it. The fragments speak of something that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, perceiving all possible outcomes of any situation. It doesn't plan in the way we do because it can see all possible plans and their results. Marcus felt a chill as he began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. An entity that could perceive multiple dimensions and predict outcomes would have known from the moment of its imprisonment exactly how to escape. It had simply been waiting for the right opportunity and gathering the necessary knowledge. How long ago was it imprisoned, he asked. Approximately 50,000 of your years, Elder Corvash replied. And how long have you been maintaining the current barrier system? The biomechanical integration has been in use for the past 5,000 years. Before that, we used purely mechanical systems that required much more active maintenance. Marcus saw the pattern immediately. The corruption started right around the time your system reached the level of sophistication needed for the entity to exploit it. It's been waiting for you to develop exactly the kind of neural interfaces it needed to communicate through. The council fell silent as the full implications sank in. They had unknowingly spent centuries building the very tool their prisoner would use to escape. So what do we do? Asked the younger dragon whose jade-colored hide betrayed her anxiety. How do we fight something that can predict our every move? Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking through the problem from every angle his engineering mind could conceive. We don't try to outthink it, he said finally. We do something completely unpredictable. What do you mean? Random chaos isn't really random if it's being directed by intelligence, even multidimensional intelligence. But genuine randomness, truly unpredictable actions, those might be something it can't anticipate because there's no logical pattern to predict. Keeper Zorith leaned forward with interest. You're suggesting we introduce random elements into our defense systems? More than that, Marcus said, his excitement growing as the solution took shape in his mind. We're going to give the entity exactly what it doesn't expect, complete unpredictability. Instead of trying to filter out its false signals, we're going to flood the system with so much random noise that its carefully crafted corruption becomes meaningless. The concept was audacious and dangerous. Marcus was proposing to temporarily disrupt the entire dragon communication network with controlled chaos, essentially jamming their own systems to prevent the entity from using them. It would be like performing surgery while blind, relying on instinct and experience rather than precise planning. The risks are enormous, Elder Corvash pointed out. If we lose control of the random signal generation, we could damage the barrier system beyond repair. And if we don't try it, the entity breaks free in less than 4 weeks, Marcus countered. Sometimes the only way to save a system is to shut it down completely and rebuild from scratch. Over the next day and night, Marcus worked with the Dragon engineers to design what they called the Chaos Protocol. It would involve every dragon simultaneously generating random mental noise, overwhelming their own communication networks with unpredictable signals. During this chaos, small teams would work to physically repair the damaged neural interfaces of affected dragons, replacing them with new crystalline structures that wouldn't be vulnerable to the entity's corruption. The plan required perfect timing and absolute trust. Marcus would coordinate the entire operation from a central platform, using his human neural patterns as a template for the random signal generation. Because his mind worked differently from dragon consciousness, his thought patterns would serve as an additional layer of unpredictability. Are you certain your nervous system can handle the interface load? Keeper Zorith asked as they prepared the neural connection equipment. You'll be channeling signals from hundreds of dragons simultaneously while maintaining conscious control of the randomization process. Marcus looked at the crystalline headset that would link his mind to the dragon network. It was far more sophisticated than anything he had worked with during his military service, but the principle was the same: direct neural interface with electronic systems. I've done similar things before, just not at this scale, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Besides, we don't really have a choice. As the dragons took their positions across all the platforms of the Nexus, Marcus felt the weight of 2 worlds resting on his shoulders. If his plan failed, Earth would face chaos beyond imagination, and the dragon civilization would be destroyed in the process. But if they did nothing, the outcome would be the same, just slightly delayed. Initiating Chaos Protocol in 30 seconds. Marcus announced through the network, his voice carried by dragon mental communication to every participant. Remember, complete randomness. Don't try to make your signals coherent or meaningful. Just let your minds generate pure noise. The countdown reached 0, and suddenly, Marcus's consciousness exploded outward into the dragon network. The sensation was indescribable, like being connected to hundreds of alien minds, all thinking different thoughts at the same time. But instead of the usual harmony of dragon communication, this was controlled chaos, a storm of mental noise that defied any pattern or prediction. Through the chaos, Marcus could sense the entity's confusion. For the first time in millennia, it couldn't predict what would happen next, because there was nothing logical to predict. The carefully crafted corruption signals became lost in the flood of random noise, their subtle patterns overwhelmed by pure, meaningless static. Repair teams, go! Marcus shouted, both mentally and vocally, as dragon medical specialists rushed to begin the delicate work of replacing damaged neural interfaces. They had perhaps an hour before the Chaos Protocol would exhaust the participants and leave them vulnerable to renewed attack. Working with surgical precision despite the mental noise surrounding them, the repair teams began the painstaking process of removing corrupted crystalline structures and growing new ones in their place. Marcus monitored their progress while simultaneously maintaining the random signal flood. His consciousness stretched between his human awareness and the alien dragon network. Halfway through the procedure, something unexpected happened. The entity, frustrated by its inability to penetrate the chaos, began trying a different approach. Instead of subtle corruption, it started generating massive power surges, attempting to overload the dragon neural systems through brute force. It's changing tactics, Marcus warned the network. Everyone increase signal variance. Don't let it find any patterns to lock onto. The dragons responded by pushing their random signal generation to even higher levels, but Marcus could feel the strain on their systems. Several of the older dragons were beginning to falter, their capacity for sustained mental noise reaching its limits. Repair status report. Marcus called out. 60% complete, came the response from the medical teams. But We're running out of time. Several patients are showing signs of neural exhaustion. Marcus made a split-second decision that went against every safety protocol they had established. Instead of maintaining his coordinating role, he began channeling his own consciousness directly into the most critical repair operations, using his human neural patterns to provide additional interference against the entity's brute force attacks. The sensation was like being struck by lightning while drowning in an ocean of alien thoughts. Marcus felt his human consciousness fragmenting under the load, pieces of his identity scattering across the Dragon network. But he held on, driven by the same stubborn determination that had carried him through impossible situations in his military career. 80% complete, the medical teams reported. Just a few more minutes. But Marcus could feel the network beginning to collapse around him. The dragons were reaching their limits, and the entity was adapting to their chaos patterns faster than they had anticipated. In moments, the entire chaos protocol would fail, leaving them more vulnerable than before. Then, Marcus remembered something from his earliest training as a mechanic. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. Instead of trying to maintain the complex chaos pattern, he began broadcasting a single, simple signal. His own memories of working alone in his garage, the quiet repetition of fixing broken machines, the peaceful emptiness of his solitary life in Millbrook. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entity, which had been adapting to complex randomness, was completely unprepared for such simple, quiet humanity. Marcus's memories of ordinary human life were so far outside its experience that it couldn't process them at all. Repairs complete, the medical teams announced as the last corrupted interface was replaced. All affected dragons are showing normal neural patterns. Marcus began shutting down the chaos protocol in stages, carefully bringing the dragon network back to normal operation. As the mental noise faded, he found himself back in his own consciousness, exhausted but triumphant. Around him, the dragons were slowly recovering from their ordeal, their bioluminescent patterns returning to healthy, synchronized pulses. But their victory was only the first step. The entity was still imprisoned, still intelligent, and now aware that the dragons had found a way to counter its corruption attacks. It would adapt, learning from this experience just as it had learned from everything else over the millennia. We need a permanent solution, Marcus told the council as they gathered to assess their situation. This bought us time, but it didn't solve the underlying problem. Elder Corvash nodded wearily. Do you have suggestions? Marcus looked out at the vast machinery of the barrier system, now functioning normally but still vulnerable to future attacks. We need to change the fundamental nature of the prison, he said. Instead of just containing the entity, we need to isolate it completely from any possibility of communication or influence. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with the Dragon engineers to design what they called the Silence Protocol. Instead of maintaining active barriers that required constant communication and adjustment, they would create a static prison that operated without any external control or monitoring. The entity would remain contained, but it would have no way to observe or influence the systems that held it. The process required rebuilding major portions of the barrier system and accepting that they would never again be able to monitor the entity's status. It was a leap of faith, trusting that a static prison would hold something that had nearly escaped from an active one. Are you certain this will work? Keeper Zorith asked as they prepared to implement the final phase of the Silence Protocol. Marcus honestly wasn't certain. The engineering was sound, and the theory was solid, but they were dealing with an entity that existed beyond normal understanding. It's the best solution I can design with the knowledge and resources we have, he said, and it's certainly better than the alternative. The implementation of the Silence Protocol took 3 days of careful work. When it was complete, the vast machinery that maintained the barriers between worlds had been transformed into something simpler, but more robust. Instead of complex biomechanical interfaces requiring constant dragon attention, the system now operated on self-contained physical principles that couldn't be corrupted or influenced by outside intelligence. As Marcus stood on the central platform, watching the last phases of the conversion, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It was the same feeling he got when he successfully rebuilt an engine that everyone else had given up on. The knowledge that broken things could be fixed if you understood them well enough and were willing to try unconventional solutions. The barriers are stable, Keeper Zorth reported. All dimensional boundaries are secure, and there's no trace of corruption in any of our systems. Marcus nodded, but he was already thinking about his return to Earth. The dragons had offered to let him stay in their realm permanently, to continue working with their technology and exploring the intersection of biological and mechanical systems. It was a tempting offer for someone who had always been fascinated by impossible problems. But as he looked around at the alien beauty of the Nexus, Marcus realized that he missed his simple life in Millbrook. He missed his garage, his routine, even the loneliness that had seemed so oppressive before his adventure began. The difference now was that the loneliness would be a choice rather than a prison. "I'd like to go home now," he told the 3 dragons who had originally brought him to their realm. "Of course," the blue dragon replied, "but know that you will always be welcome here. You have saved not only our civilization, but your own world as well." Marcus smiled. "I just fixed some broken systems. That's what mechanics do." The journey back to Earth was gentler than the trip to the Dragon Realm, perhaps because Marcus now understood what was happening to him. When the reality shift completed, he found himself standing in his garage exactly where he had been when the dragons first approached him. The carburetor parts were still on his workbench, waiting to be assembled. For a moment, Marcus wondered if the entire experience had been some kind of elaborate dream. But then he noticed the subtle changes in himself. A confidence he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond the simple routine of daily life, and knowledge of technologies and possibilities that would keep his mind occupied for the rest of his life. He picked up the carburetor parts and began reassembling them, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. But as he worked, Marcus found himself thinking about the dragons and their remarkable civilization, about the entity that had nearly escaped its dimensional prison, and about the delicate balance that kept chaos from spilling into ordered reality. When he finished the carburetor repair, Marcus stepped outside to look up at the evening sky. To anyone else in Millbrook, it looked exactly as it always had. Stars scattered across the darkness, peaceful and unchanging. But Marcus knew better now. He knew that somewhere beyond the visible stars, 3 alien dragons were maintaining a watch over barriers that protected his world from forces he couldn't even imagine. The next morning brought a return to routine: coffee, toast, and the familiar sounds of his garage. But when Mrs. Patterson brought her old Ford in for repair, Marcus found himself listening to her troubles with a patience and understanding he had never shown before. When young Tommy Rodriguez asked if he could watch the repair work, Marcus took the time to explain what he was doing and why, remembering how much he had learned from watching others work when he was young. Over the following months, Marcus's garage gradually became more than just a place where broken machines got fixed. It became a gathering place for anyone in Millbrook who needed someone to listen, someone to help solve problems that seemed impossible. Marcus never spoke about his adventure with the dragons, but somehow his neighbors sensed that something had changed in the quiet mechanic who lived on the edge of their small town. He still worked alone most of the time, still kept to his simple routine, still found peace in the solitude of his garage. But the loneliness was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged, fixing broken things, helping people solve their problems, and keeping watch over a small corner of a world that was far more complex and wonderful than most people ever imagined. Sometimes, on clear evenings when the stars were particularly bright, Marcus would look up at the sky and smile, remembering 3 alien dragons who had sought out a lonely mechanic because they believed he could help save 2 worlds. And in the quiet darkness of his garage, surrounded by the tools and machines that had always been his companions, Marcus Thompson would continue doing what he had always done best, making broken things work again, one repair at a time.